And Mark is going to talk about polarisation and purpose, the secrets of success. Mark is the founder and owner of Ellandi. So I will pass you over to Mark. It's down. Down is next.
Down is next. I don't really like these microphones. If I speak loudly, can you hear me at the back? Does that work? Cool. Right, make life a wee bit easier. Okie dokie. So, right, my name's Mark Robinson. I'm the founder of Ellandi. We'll come on to that in 2 seconds. As it's been mentioned, this is a sort of forerunner for the Revo conference, which we're happy to be holding in Manchester this year. I'm the president-elect of Revo. Revo, as you may know, used to be known as the British Council of Shopping Centres, and people think it went through a renaming exercise because it changed its name, strangely enough. But it really wasn't a renaming. It was a rebranding, a repurposing. And it's a repurposing away from being focused just on shopping centres to being about placemaking for the entire community. So anybody who's involved in property, placemaking, the sense of place, really should have an interest in engaging with us and getting involved. And hopefully I'll see plenty of you up there tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, next year. So who are Ellandi? Ellandi was formed 10 years ago. We formed in the early 2008, so it was just before the crash. I formed the business with an investment banker. We thought there was going to be a bit of a correction, but you've got to be careful what you careful what you wish for sometimes, because it obviously got an awful lot worse than we were expecting. Having said that, we dusted ourselves off, and over the last 10 years, we've been involved in 35 different projects across towns in the UK, delivering change to those communities. The portfolio currently stands at 30 million quid. This week it's worth just over £1 billion. Next week, who knows? I'm not going to lie to you. Things are pretty tough in the retail world. But hopefully what I'm going to give you today is a toolkit or a way of looking at the challenges and opportunities that we face in our town centres to actually pick up on the opportunity and make our places better going forward. In covering all of those things, hopefully in this presentation I'll cover these things. So we'll talk about customer behaviour, what's driving this structural change, the purposeful consumer, what it means for our town centres and what we can do about it. And then at the end, I was going to have questions, but I think we're on a tight timescale. If you ever do any presentation training, you're basically told only try and get three things across. And you've got a lot of speakers today, so I'm only going to try and get 2 things across. And those 2 things are polarisation and purpose. So I'll come back to polarisation and purpose an awful lot. And by the end of it, you'll understand what I'm talking about, hopefully. So let's talk about what's going on in the UK retail market. Back in the day, it used to be very, very simple. Somebody saw an advert for some goods, they went into their town, they tried it on, and they bought it, and maybe they returned it. That worked for decades. What's happened over the last 10 years is it's got a little bit more complex. As you can see there, it's social media active, there's different sorts of facilitation, different ways you can buy things, different ways you can return things. And that places massive challenges on everybody, not just us as local authorities, us as town centre investors. It places real challenges on the retailers as well. Because if they're honest, when you do talk to them, they're very unsure how to place value and what adds value to their chain anymore. We're in this massive state of flux at the moment. The best research that does show us is that approximately about 15 to 20% of all retail sales are going online. And then of that, about 30% of that does still go through the store in one shape or form. But it really does change from different type of good to different type of good, and it's still not settled yet. The other thing that's really very clear to us at the moment is that where we have retail places and where our consumers want retail places are no longer aligned. And that's a massive challenge for us all as well. So what does this lead to? This leads to polarisation. A really good example of that is probably locally. You can look to the Trafford Centre, or Into Trafford, as they like to call it these days. That's a destination. We all know what a destination looks like these days. It's about a place you'll go to for a day. It's experiential. You'll have all the big brands there. You'll have cinemas. You'll have all sorts of other uses. It's where you go and spend the money you sometimes don't even have. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, and I'll sort of illuminate that with a local scheme that we own, Middleton, which is a thriving community scheme. It serves the very immediate need for those customers on a value and convenience basis. And this is a trend that's happening globally. It's happening very strongly in the UK at the moment, but it's absolutely happening everywhere. I was at MIPIM Asia. This is happening in China. Customers know what they want. They have a purpose. And what they want to do is go and be entertained, or they want something cheaply and quickly, at the most basic way of describing it, which does retain a problem. Because obviously if these two ends of the spectrum are thriving, that leaves us with what we call the squeeze middle. Now the squeeze middle, how big is it? How deep is the problems? Well, again, it sort of depends on the location, but putting it up there, I think it gives you some idea of some of the brands that we've seen get into trouble because they no longer fulfill a purpose for their customers. They are part of the squeeze middle. So that's polarization for you. So I talked about the purposeful shopper. So we've done a lot of research with CACI and a lot of proprietary research ourselves. And what's very clear is the purposeful shopper has two shopping missions. They want to have a clear offer. Now that's often the experiential. It's not always high end, but they know what they want. And the retailers who are thriving, and all those retailers are thriving, know their customers, know what their customers want, and they deliver it. At the other end of the spectrum, we're back at value and convenience. And again, you'll recognize those names. Again, stock market listings for those businesses, they are absolutely flying. And also worth noting that an awful lot of them don't have internet facilitation because they don't need it for their business model. The internet is not killing everything. How does this translate into our sort of built environment? Well, that translates into these destination centres we were talking about and the local shopping centres we were talking about. Ellandi, why don't we call ourselves the leading value and convenience shopping centre investor? Is because we think that community, George picked up on this, it's so much more than just what you do. It's the people who are there, why they're there, and what they want out of it. That's why we call our investments community shopping centres. When shoppers are going to these locations, what are they doing? It's quite, again, because of polarisation, it's really quite diverse in how they spend their money. So I won't go through this slide in any great detail because it really speaks for itself. But worth bearing in mind, because people go to these local schemes an awful lot more, and they are spending £30–35 a trip, and to give you some idea, they're the Ellandi figures for our schemes, the actual amount of throughput going through smaller town centres far outweighs major schemes, although clearly they're the ones that get all the headlines, get all the research, and often win all of the awards. So, if you understand polarisation and you understand that shoppers have purpose, they're purposeful shoppers, you need to understand your visitor. The Local Government Association has done a brilliant bit of work around a framework for revitalising town centres. I think the first F is all about research. You've got to know your customer and do that research. We invest a lot of time and money at that, doing that at Ellandi. So you've got to understand who your visitor is, how do they behave, how do they want to behave when they're in their town centre, and what do they want from your town centre as well. If you're going to start on this journey of transforming your town centre, this is the gold dust you need to mine for, because without this, you're not going to be able to place your town centre on that polarisation spectrum, and you're not going to be able to understand the purpose that it needs to fulfil. So, in 2008 and going forward, you have to have a clear identity as to your customer, and you must have a clear idea of the purpose of your town centre. By the way, I know this is we're all in cinema and we're talking about leisure, and I'm speaking about retail. I'm doing this because, frankly, the problem is being caused by retail. That is the problem. I'm now going to go on and hopefully address some of the solutions. But before I go on, let's talk about how bad it might get in the squeeze middle. I think it's fair to say it's not just about size. I think if a place is not fit for purpose, it could have 1 million square feet and it could have problems. It's about being right-sized for your people. It's about having that connection with the need of the user. So I think there are going to be some towns that are going to fail and cities are going to fail that people are going to be surprised at because they do not fulfill that need, that purpose that the purposeful customers are demanding. To put some figures on that, so we've done the research with CACI. There are 2,700 shopping retail destinations in the UK. There's about 850 shopping centres. They estimate that the UK is oversupplied by retail space by about 17%. But at least 49% of retail spaces are oversupplied with retail. So how does that work out? Well, it works out because you've got big concentrations of oversupply in that squeeze middle. And what are the characteristics of those places? They're going to be average retail spaces, smaller regional towns, tertiary centres. There are an awful lot of places that work kind of okay, and with a bit of tweaking can go on to thrive. And then there are obviously places as well which, as polarisation plays out, and as this spend from the middle is diverted to either end, can also thrive as well. So, what's going to drive this quite dramatic change in the squeeze middle? Excuse me. Let me explain a little further. I think it's going to come down to department stores. Traditionally, town centres, shopping centres have been anchored by anchor stores, department stores. And, we already know that M&S want to pull out of 100 towns. We already know that half of the BHSs that have gone vacant are still vacant. We know that House of Fraser, before the Mike Ashley takeover, wanted to close 31 stores. We could go on. It's pretty grim. But, why is this happening? What's driving this? Well, clearly, the customer does not see a purpose fulfilled by these department stores anymore. At the end of the day, a regional department store used to be the one place you could go to for Ralph Lauren or Ted Baker. You can now get that online. So these department stores no longer fulfill a purpose. But there's a statistical way of showing this as well, if we compare ourselves to America and to Europe. So these figures are the number of department stores per million people. And I think that does paint a bit of a picture of the direction of travel in the UK, unfortunately. In the States, we're very comparable to the States in the number of department stores we have. We've got way more than we have in Europe. And I'm not saying we're going to go down that low, but it is going to become less. And it's these towns where they are going to lose their department stores that are going to have to change their purpose. Because if you lose your traditional anchors, the purpose of that town changes. So let's talk about the opportunity now. So how do we replace those department store anchors with other anchors? So look, let's talk about the challenges and then the opportunities. So there's obviously in these squeeze middle, there's weakening demand for shops. Values are under pressure, there's a lack of purpose, and there's one use. Retail was far too successful. It was the most valuable use in the UK, and it squeezed out all those other uses from our great town centres that used to cause them to thrive because it was just too expensive. And what we really need to do is start cramming all of these things back in. So, the weakening demand for retail, how do we address that? Well, we bring in other uses. Values are under pressure. Well, great. It means you can start, especially local authorities doing a lot of this, it means you can step in and start buying things at a decent value. And also what it then does is facilitate bringing in these alternative uses. PRS, cinema, leisure, all sorts of other uses now have higher value than retail. So it makes sense to demal, it makes sense to reduce the retail footprint. It means we can start curating places that are fit for the future, that are sustainable, that are the places that people want going forward. And let's celebrate this to a degree. We're talking about the end of Clone Town. Let's not mourn the end of these clone towns. Let's make our town centres, our city centres, fit for the population that live around them. Let's give them the purpose that they're demanding. So, some of the solutions. So I'm going to rattle through this because we've got a limited time. So here are some of the smaller solutions that we're doing currently within the Ellandi portfolio that go from the sublime to the ridiculous. We're doing things like serviced offices in Stockport. We're putting hotels into vacant office mall space in Chester. Really very interesting in Southampton. We've got a project with the Town Council local authority. We're putting a shared workspace into some second floor space to retain the graduates, which usually graduate at Southampton University and then go up to London. Let's keep them in our towns. Let's keep them in our cities so they can be part of rebuilding them. One at the bottom left, Bugtopia. It's basically going to be sort of an indoor sort of safari park in the first floor of a department store in Kettering that we think could really help reposition the town centre as a place to go entertain your kids. Plenty of other things I could have put up here, but let's move on and look at the sort of the bigger macro things. Just to warn you, so every year Ellandi does a thing called Retail Rocks, and one of the unique things is we ask questions of the audience to make it a little bit more interactive. And some of these examples I've managed to find some of the people in the room are already doing it. And I think that's something pleased to take away from this is, yes, we have big challenges at the moment, but when I look across the whole of the UK, if you put together all of the individual great things that are happening, the solutions are there. We just need to talk to each other more about them and, do what George did. Talk about what's gone very well, but also say, look, I would have done things differently. And that's really important and really powerful as we, all move forward together. So, George mentioned this. Residential is crucially important for revitalising our town centres. It was crowded out by this retail use. Having said that, it is not the sole answer. I was quoted in the press by saying this, and it's a little bit crude, but it is actually true. If you build crap flats above a crap shopping centre, you've still got a crap town centre. You've got to be a little bit more considered about this. If you pile a load of flats into a town centre that's not working, at best you will become a dormitory town. And that doesn't serve anybody, really, apart from the big city, which you're housing their workers in, perhaps. So when we're thinking about what we're doing in terms of residential, let's think about the tenure, let's think about the age of the people. There's a great opportunity not only for young people to live in town centres, but older people to live in town centres as well, for example. Right, leisure. We're in a cinema. Leisure does play a huge part. The picture on the right is, again, Middleton. It's a Fitness for Less that we put in there into 30,000 square feet. 10,000 visitors a week are going there. We've reported footfall up in certain stores by 14%, turnover up in certain stores by over 14%. They really can play a massive role in regenerating and bringing people back to the town centres, just in the way George described. Now, we've talked about cinemas. Ellandi has a number of cinemas in our portfolio. They range from the destination. So really, cinemas will not fix all ills. Much like retail, you've got to understand what that cinema is doing in terms of purpose. So we've got a number of different types of cinema in our portfolio that fulfil different purposes. In Eastleigh, we've got a major view cinema. That's part of a major leisure development that's got 11 other restaurants in there. St Austell, completely different. It's a community cinema. It's got 2 or 3 screens with 2 restaurants below it. And very different. There's not so many of these in the UK, but this does work and it thrives. We have a discount cinema in Romford, which actually works very, very well, considering that there is a destination cinema and leisure park at the brewery at the other end of town. So if you are considering leisure, if you are considering a cinema, and I'm sure people will speak about this later, make sure it's the right sort of cinema that's going to speak to the purpose that people want from your town. Employment use is massively important. I think this is often forgotten when people are talking about regenerating their town centres. You have to have lots of uses, and you have to have lots of people using those uses at different times of day. Bringing employment use into your town centre brings well-paid people in who are going to top up shop, pop out to restaurants, have lunch with their friends, buy things on the way home, do click and collect. Other forms of employment use that we could see coming back into town centres to fill some of the void that's going to be left from the shrinking retail might be last mile delivery for the internet. It's there, let's embrace it. Another idea for the future going forward, which I think excites me a little bit, is how technology might change things through 3D printing, for example. How might 3D printing bring micro manufacturing back into town centres? The fact that we're very much more aware of sustainability and environmentalism, does that mean we're going to make, do, amend and bring things into town to be repaired so that we can take them home again? These are all things we should be aware of and thinking about going forward. Public services, absolutely massive. I mean, there are things in the world as a local authority you can control. There's things you can't control. Where your offices are, where your services are clearly one of them. I can certainly think of an example that we're involved in Eastleigh, where they sold off their edge of town campus for housing, bought a 1970s office building, reskinned it, brought 300, 400, 500 relatively well-paid workers into the town centre, doing all of those linked shopping trips, click and collect that we talked about in the previous slide. So I think, I've trotted through quite a few things there. We could have probably spent an hour talking about any one of them in any detail. And as I said, a lot of people in this room are doing this stuff anyway. But one thing that we are, absolutely convinced is what we're going through within our town centres is structural change. This is not cyclical. What has gone before will not happen again. So what we all need to do collectively is keep learning from each other and put in place solutions which are fit for the sustainable future rather than looking backwards. So, hopefully what I've done is talked about the prism of looking at your town centre through polarisation and through your purposeful shopper. Just give you a few takeaways in terms of how you can put those solutions in place with a wider framework. So, firstly, let's think about repurposing our town centres. Let's not think about regeneration. For me, regeneration sounds like you're making it what it was before, trying to go back to former glories. We're not there. This is structural change. This time it is different. So back to that purposing word, let's repurpose our town centres for things going forward. Repositioning is slightly different. You've got to understand where your town centre sits within local, national hierarchies. There's no point in aspiring to be something you can't be, but likewise, you know, if there is something to build on, grasp it and reposition your town centre to take advantage of it. Right sizing almost goes without saying, given what I've said before. Do not be afraid of shrinking your town centre, certainly shrinking the retail element, because the market's going to do it. Why not get ahead of that? And then re-engagement. This is massively important. For me, this really speaks to placemaking, and I think placemaking means lots of different things to different people. For a lot of people, it means building something and creating a nice public space. For us, placemaking is a process, and it's an ongoing process, and it's something you've got to keep revisiting and topping up. You know, great example of a town where we're involved in that would be Stockton. You know, they've got a great public realm. They have great events there. Being honest and learning from things, has it completely revitalised the retail offer? No. Has it led to lots of other contingent benefits in terms of nightlife, sustainability, it being a great place to go out now? Absolutely. So, finally, we've talked to polarisation and purpose. They're the things you've got to look out for and understand. We've talked about the 4 R's, the framework for your strategy. So, implementation, what's it going to require? So, creative thought and bold leadership, absolutely. Again, George spoke about that. I'm absolutely, very happy to say that some of the best, most innovative thinking that we're involved in is with the private sector. In many, many locations, local authorities are ahead of where the private sector are. They're certainly prepared to be more bold. I talked about it briefly in terms of repositioning. I think you need to understand where your town sits within a regional and local hierarchy. One of the dangers with localism is a sort of beggar thy neighbour policy. Not every town can do the same thing. Again, we've got to differentiate our town centres and make them fit for purpose and different from what is available elsewhere. And I thought I'd leave this at the end. I think local authorities, major stakeholders in town centres, what they need is a new way of delivering these things going forward. And we're calling that strategic delivery partnerships. Ellandi, we've got this huge baked-in experience of dealing with the private sector. Over 11 institutions have backed us to the tune of £1 billion to deliver change across the UK. That's what we do. We deliver change, and that's the sort of partnership that we want to go into with many people in the room. So thanks for your time. Hopefully there's a few takeaways from there, and won't do questions now, but if you see me afterwards or see me at Revo, collar me, and I'll happily talk about this stuff for hours. Cheers.